and jump back in where we were and finish chapter 1. We make this a little bigger. Okay, everybody see that preamble to the Declaration? About the unalienable rights? Give a yes or a thumbs up or a here. Okay. So you need to know those 4 core values once again, pages 8 through 10. But we want to focus on for today the idea of politics and power in our government, or power and politics, whatever you want to say, because we've got this system set up, or our founding fathers instituted a system with the Constitution. On Friday or Monday, whichever it may be, we're going to talk about how the Constitution was not the first government that we had in America. Does anybody know what it was?
Articles of Confederation.
Articles of Confederation. You get 1,000 professor points. Who was that?
Me, Ryan King.
All right, keep track of your professor points. The Articles of Confederation. But for our discussion today, when the Constitution, because the Articles only lasted 6 years and they weren't effective, so when they enacted the Constitution, they set up a system that they wanted the power to be not diluted, but they wanted it to be well balanced, so that no person or group had more power than any other. So as we talk about politics and power, I want to begin by going back to England and show you this little triangle chart that will be on the test. And of course, I will post it after class with the slides from Wednesday and from Monday and today. But when English subjects started coming to America, they were coming from an English society that had a system which we refer to as the Great Chain of Being. Now, on top was the monarch or the king / queen, whichever it may have been. And even the people back then, as many do today, but not all, recognized that above the king was God. And whoever was king, that was by God's decree, whether they were a good king or whether they were a scumbag. They were the king by divine right, and that's just the way it was. Now, when I was learning this in school. My professor said there's even one more between God and the king, and that's Elvis floating around up here. But anyway, I didn't agree with him, but I just thought I'd share that with you. Might be a good bonus sometime. So you had the king or queen, and they were really kind of like a figurehead. And we're talking about England. If you go to like France, you had what was called absolutism, and I'll show you a little thing on that here in a little bit. But absolutism was the belief that the king or queen had absolute power. In English society at the time that people started coming to the New World, the king had become, I mean, the king was still the leader, but there were nobles, and they ran the society. The nobles were your wealthy landowners, and in running the society, we're talking more about the culture. They were to basically, with their wealth, their property, their land, they were to communicate a status to the inferior people of society to impress them. And then slightly underneath the nobles, you had knights and vassals, which were referred to as the gentry. Now, they were a small percentage of the country, but they ran the country. Now, again, they're answerable to the king, but they have power to run the country. This is not a democracy. The knights and vassals were people that had some money, but nothing like the nobles. So the nobles were to communicate their status of superiority and be the ones who set the tone for society or culture. The knights and the vassals ran the country. We're talking politically, and they would be servants of the king, do the king's bidding. Underneath them, you had the yeomen, which included farmers, those that were merchants, and then those that had crafts. Your farmers had some land, but not much. And then underneath the yeomen, you had peasants and serfs. These would be people that had no land. They would work for others. And then even underneath them, you had slaves. They were people who were owned by other people higher up in society. They had nothing, not even rights. But in this great chain of being, there was an underlying attitude or understanding. So they all had this understanding that this was something that was ordered by God. And the attitude was you always defer to those that are better than you. You defer to your betters. So serfs would defer to craftsmen, or vassals, knights, nobles, and of course the king. Knights have to defer to nobles and the king. You defer. And you do not, because this is divinely ordered, you do not attempt to try to improve your lot. You stay within your ordered boundaries. So after being in America for a couple of 100 years, coming into the 18th century, the 1700s, you had these 13 colonies that had established their own state governments. Even though they were still subjects to England, you had state governments in Virginia and Connecticut and Georgia, and all the states had their own governments, and they had their own religions. And people could come over and get stakes of land and have their own homestead. And so Americans, that is British subjects who were in the New World, were away from the homeland where this was, and they had set up state governments and systems that were much different. And the people, they had that taste of liberty, democracy. They had that taste of possibly economic mobility, being able to better their lives. And so Americans wanted to eliminate this whole chain of being, right? They wanted that principle of equality. No one is better simply because of who the family you were born into or your status. Everybody has equality, which means everybody has equal rights as moral beings, and everyone is equal in their opportunity to work and move up in society. That's what Americans wanted. John Locke, who is an important influence on our founding fathers when it comes to political thinking, especially thinking about individualism, said, all mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. In other words, everyone should have equality and liberty as long as we do not harm other people or infringe upon their property or their health. Thomas Jefferson, who was an important influence on our Declaration of Independence and our early government, the Constitution, said that when the people fear the government, that is tyranny. But when the government fears the people, that is liberty, or there is liberty. In England, the lowers feared those that ran the country and the society. Americans wanted to get rid of that and have liberty. Liberty of conscience, liberty of civil liberties, political liberties, and religious liberties. So we read this last week, or last Monday, in the Declaration. Whenever a government starts to abuse their power, then it's the right and the duty of people to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. Translation, come up with a government system that will be fairly balanced in its power so that it guards all the people's interests from any person or any group trying to once again abuse their power. So, as we talked about, they came up with the system of democracy. But remember, it's not pure democracy, because the writers of the Constitution were afraid of pure democracy, which they felt was a mob rule or a mobocracy. A couple of other things that our textbook mentions between pages 14 through the end of the chapter was we set up our democracy so that it is a majoritarianism democracy, one in which the leaders respond to the desires of the majority. But that could be dangerous. If the majority rules, they could take advantage of and abuse the minority. So we have also a constitutional democracy in which there's limits on those who govern. It gives everyone a voice, and it protects the minority groups from abuse by the majority. An example that we can understand is in this 1960s, the passage of civil rights was to give minority groups, African Americans, women, Asian Americans, to give them the same rights that the majority of Caucasian Americans enjoyed. So we're not a straight up majoritarianism. We have an element of pluralism in which special interests can have a say in our government too, small groups or minorities. So that's what a constitutional democracy is. We have a constitution that clearly outlines what our government can and cannot do. And then, of course, with the Bill of Rights, it protects the rights of individuals. And our Constitution has set up that there be fair, free, and frequent elections. Because we don't want the same people in office ruling for years and years and years, even though that happens in the Congress as far as representatives and senators. There are groups of people even now working to try to get that changed to where our congressmen and women, that is senators and representatives, have term limits just like the president. Another thing about constitutionalism that we'll touch on here in a little bit is that because we believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that quote in the Declaration that Jefferson wrote is really kind of a modification from what John Locke said. Basically life, liberty, and property or possessions. Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness So that would include having property and land. So a part of our Constitution is that it protects private property. You, if you were in that society in England, a couple of hundred years before, and you were a yeoman, or I'm not a yeoman, but a serf or a peasant, you could not own property. And if you were a farmer or a merchant, you might have some property, but not a lot. The majority of the land, not property, but land. Yeah, property. I'm getting property and possessions mixed up. The majority of the property or land was in control by the king and the nobles and the vassals and knights. President Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, came to define democracy as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Of, by, and for. And then today we can understand democracy as a means of selecting our leaders or policymakers and organizing the government so that policy represents and responds to the preferences of the public, that is, the people. Any questions? So democracy wants to delegate power, and we will eventually soon talk about the three branches of our government so that there is a separation of powers as well as a balance of power. And this differs, here's what I mentioned earlier, absolutism. Many European countries had this system of government where the king was appointed by God and therefore had absolute power. And some philosophers who basically supported this understanding were Thomas Hobbes and Robert Filmer. Constitutionalism, in which the law rules the land, comes again from John Locke. And so remember this, guys and gals. When we see our president on TV, that person is not the ruler of our nation. When we see one of our congressmen talking about a decision that Congress made, Congress, they are not the rulers of this nation. When the Supreme Court makes a decision, they are not the rulers of this country. All three of those branches are subject to the law, which the supreme law of our land is the Constitution. And all of our leaders must govern according to the laws within the Constitution. An example of there being concern that maybe one of the branches is trying to exercise authority that they don't have was a couple of weeks ago when President Trump was threatening states that if they don't go back to school or yeah, if states do not decide to go back to school, he might sign an executive order ordering all states to basically order all school systems to go back to school. Well, underneath our Constitution and the section on the executive branch, the presidency, the president does not have that kind of power. Yes, presidents have issued executive orders, but they can be vetoed by the Congress if Congress believes that the president is abusing his authority. Does that make sense? Our government is not like this class where Instructor Bings is the supreme leader, right? Like, oh, what's the name of the supreme leader in Hunger Games? President Snow? Is that right?
Yep.
That's me in this class. No, I'm just kidding. I will allow you to, actually, not me, but the syllabus. If you guys read the syllabus is really kind of like our contract for this class. And I think it gives you, Carl Albert provides in that syllabus, like in there, I think there's a section on student complaints. So that might be a poor analogy, but hopefully you guys get the point. The president is not the ultimate ruler of our nation like the king was in England. Our founding fathers wanted to avoid having a king. Congress, I would argue that Congress has a little bit more influence, but they too are not the supreme rulers. And a lot of times it depends on who the president is and whether or not the president was a strong president who exercised a lot of influence, like Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt believed that the presidency was what he called a bully pulpit. He wanted to use the presidency to have great influence, but he wanted to help the people of the country. So anyway, what would we do if we got a leader who craved power and did not care about the people? That's what we want to protect against. Okay, the final thing we want to touch on that the chapter touches on is that our Constitution is set up so that there can be free enterprise or a free market system. There can be individual property ownership, and there can be a market system in which there can be businesses, corporations, and this is much different than not only the European countries that many of our immigrant forefathers came from, but you had other forms of government which you still have today, like communism. Communism is a system in which the government owns all the land and the government owns all the businesses. And if you're a citizen of that country, they will try to give to each one the same amount of, maybe a job or places to live, apartments that are very similar. There would be no home ownership. You wouldn't be able to pick your occupation. That's communism, where the government owns it all and controls it all and then tries to divvy it out. And everybody is equal in that community as far as economic and what's the word I'm trying to say? Wouldn't be property. I guess financial status, but it's only going to be what the government gives you. You're not going to be able to earn more. A free market system is different than socialism. Socialism is different than communism in that instead of the government owning all of the property and all of the businesses and major industries, they own a majority of them. That's socialism. They own a majority of the major industries. They guarantee every person a minimal standard of living. But they do not try to micromanage the overall economy. Communist countries try to micromanage the economy as well. In a free market system, you have businesses, the government, and the individual. And ideally, and there was differences between the founders in this, but for many, the ideal was we want as little government intrusion into the free market as possible. Today, people who want virtually no government in any of the free market, they're called libertarians. They believe in virtually no government involvement in the economy and complete freedom of the individual to pursue financial gain. So libertarians would be, you'd have communists on one end of the spectrum, government controls everything. Libertarians would be on the other end. And our system is basically set up to be more, not in the middle, but it would be more, just a little bit more to the left of libertarianism, where the government will regulate what businesses do. And so what happened was, in the first stages of our country, businesses were taking advantage of their workers, right? Workers had to work usually 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day. And they had poor working conditions, unsafe conditions. And there was little room for people to earn more money. Well, you had, and especially with Teddy Roosevelt, you had more government involvement to basically bring the principles of democracy from government into the financial arena. So government wanted to regulate businesses so that businesses, so that just the few owners of businesses, they would not be the only ones getting rich, that their workers would get more of the pie. And eventually we had established a working week of 40 hours a week. 8-hour days, 5 days a week with days off. We've had organizations formed so that workplaces are safe. And not just for the workers, but also for the consumers. I mean, if you went to a Chicago meatpacking plant in the early 1900s and you watched how they made hamburger meat and steaks, you would never eat that again. It was so terribly filthy and unhealthy. But now we have regulations, the FDA, to keep our food healthy and safe. And that includes safe working places. So the government, in a free market system, and the way it is in America, is that the government has some influence over businesses, but it's to make sure businesses don't exploit their workers, the individuals. And also that industries and companies don't take advantage of consumers. So that's something we enjoy in our system of democracy. Know those three major divisions of our form of government that are on pages 14 through the end of the chapter. That it's a democratic system, it's a constitutional system, and it's a free market system. That is the way our government under the Constitution was set up. Any questions? What's the status on Friday's schedule for all the schools?
Ryan doesn't start until Monday.
I go to Howe and we have softball games Friday, so I won't be on Zoom.
Is that Kaylin?
Yes.
Anybody else on the softball team?
I don't think so.
Will everybody else be? Now, how you're still having school on Fridays, right, at the building?
Yeah.
So you guys will be there. Arcoma will be there. Is that a thumbs up? Okay. Diane, you don't start till Monday, right?
Yes, sir.
But you will be having school on Fridays?
We can come in this room and you can come.
We won't be having school, but we'll still be having, like, we'll still be able to come to the school to have the decision class.
Okay. So we'll see you Friday then. And
All right.
Kaylin, you can watch the recording over the weekend and get caught up. Well, if there's no questions, have a great day and a great Thursday. We will jump into chapter 2 on Friday morning.
Sure.
We'll see you then.